January 17, 1945. Western Pacific Ocean, 150 miles east of Luzon. The sky had turned the color of old iron. Waves rose like moving mountains, 30 feet high, their crests torn into horizontal spray by winds that screamed at 50 knots. The USS Essex pitched forward into a trough so deep that men on the flight deck could see nothing but walls of gray-green water on all sides. Salt spray lashed across the island superstructure with the force of buckshot. Every rivet groaned. Every weld protested. The carrier climbed the next wave at an angle that sent unsecured objects sliding across compartments. And for a moment, just a moment, hung suspended at the crest before plunging down again into the abyss. In the ready rooms below deck, pilots sat strapped into their chairs, listening to the hull flex and moan like a living thing. Some had their eyes closed. Others stared at the briefing maps without seeing them. They had flown in rain before. They had flown through clouds so thick they couldn't see their own wingtips. But this was different. Through the bulkheads came the muffled roar of wind and water, a sound so vast and primal it seemed older than warfare itself. And yet the orders stood unchanged. Launch all aircraft. Execute strike on Takao Harbor. Weather is no excuse. On the flight decks of 4 American carriers, Essex, Ticonderoga, Langley, and San Jacinto, plane handlers worked in organized chaos, lashing down aircraft that threatened to slide across the pitching deck like toys. The Hellcats and Avengers were spotted for launch, their propellers already turning, engines coughing blue exhaust into the storm. Deck crews moved between them in choreographed precision, hunched against the wind, uniforms plastered to their bodies, communicating through hand signals because voices were useless against the roar. One misstep meant being swept overboard. One loose tie-down meant an aircraft careening into another, aviation fuel igniting, men burning. They knew this. They worked anyway. And 12 miles to the west, through sheets of rain and spray, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft circled at the edge of visibility. Their radios crackled with disbelief. Their observers rubbed salt-stung eyes and looked again, because what they were seeing could not be real. The American carriers were not seeking shelter. They were not turning away from the storm. They were launching aircraft, in this weather, in seas that would capsize a destroyer if it made one wrong turn. The Americans were launching aircraft. The report that reached Combined Fleet Headquarters in Taiwan 3 hours later was marked urgent. The radio man who decoded it read it twice before bringing it to the operations officer. The operations officer read it 3 times before bringing it to Admiral Fukudome Shigeru. And Admiral Fukudome, who had commanded carrier operations since 1942, who had survived Midway and the Philippine Sea, who had seen his air groups obliterated by American fighters and his ships turned into floating pyres. Admiral Fukudome read the report and set it down carefully on his desk and said nothing for a long time. "They are launching in a typhoon," he said finally. Not a question. A statement of fact that his mind was still trying to process. The operations officer confirmed it. Visibility less than 1 mile. Seas 8 to 10 meters. Wind speed 45 knots with gusts to 60. And the Americans were conducting full-deck operations as if it were a sunny afternoon off San Diego. Fukudome had known, intellectually, that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's. He had read the intelligence estimates. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs of American shipyards where carriers stood in production lines like automobiles. But this was something else. This was not about numbers. This was about capability so overwhelming, so casual, that it redefined what naval aviation meant. The Imperial Navy canceled operations when swells exceeded 3 meters. They delayed launches if visibility dropped below 5 miles. It was doctrine. It was common sense. It was seamanship. But the Americans flew anyway. To understand the shock that rippled through Japanese Naval Command that January day, one must first understand what carrier operations meant in 1945. Aircraft carriers were the most complex weapon systems ever devised by man. They combined shipbuilding, aviation, meteorology, navigation, radio communication, and split-second coordination into a single platform that could project power across 500 miles of ocean. They were also fragile. A carrier without its aircraft was merely a large target. A carrier that lost its flight deck, through damage, through fire, through flooding, was dead in the water. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pioneered carrier warfare. At Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway, their aviators had been among the finest in the world. Superb pilots flying excellent aircraft from well-designed ships. But by 1945, that excellence had been bled away through attrition. Experienced pilots had died over the Solomons, over Rabaul, over the Marianas. Their replacements received barely enough flight hours to take off and land. Fuel shortages meant training was curtailed. Aviation gasoline was rationed like gold. Carriers sat in harbors because there was no fuel to operate them, no aircraft to fill their hangars, no pilots competent enough to fly what few planes remained. And meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Americans multiplied. By January 1945, Task Force 38 comprised 16 fleet carriers and light carriers. Not converted battleships or makeshift escort carriers. Purpose-built fleet carriers displacing 30,000 tons, each carrying 90 aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels. They operated as a mobile city, refueling at sea, rearming at sea, conducting maintenance without returning to port. They could sustain combat operations indefinitely. The logistical apparatus behind them, the supply ships, the forward bases, the transportation network, dwarfed anything Japan had ever fielded. But quantity meant nothing if you couldn't use it. And weather had always been the great equalizer. Storms didn't care about industrial capacity. Typhoons sank American ships as readily as Japanese. The ocean remained indifferent to national ideology, or so the Japanese had believed. The American doctrine of all-weather operations had not emerged from some inherent cultural superiority or technological magic. It had been learned through trial, error, and death. In December 1944, just 1 month before the storm off Luzon, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had sailed directly into Typhoon Cobra. 3 destroyers capsized and sank. 100-mile-per-hour winds tore aircraft from carrier decks and sent them spinning into the sea. Fires broke out. Men were swept overboard. Nearly 800 sailors died, more than had been lost in some major battles. The Navy convened a court of inquiry. Halsey was criticized. New weather routing procedures were implemented. But the fundamental operational philosophy remained unchanged. Maintain the offensive. The Pacific War was a race against time. Every day Japan held the Philippines was another day for them to fortify, to dig in, to prepare defenses. Every day American carriers sat idle was another day Japanese forces could regroup. The war would not pause for bad weather. Therefore, American carriers would not pause for bad weather. This required more than just courage. It required systems. The catapult launches. The arresting gears strengthened to handle aircraft slamming down on pitching decks. The training of landing signal officers who could guide a pilot onto a carrier deck that was rising and falling 30 feet with each wave. The meteorological forecasting that could predict, not perfectly, but adequately, whether conditions were dangerous or merely terrible. The redundancy built into every system, so that when something failed, there was a backup. And when the backup failed, there was a procedure. The Japanese had built their carrier doctrine around favorable conditions. Launch at dawn, recover at dusk, operate in clear weather with good visibility. Their carriers were magnificent when everything went according to plan, but war rarely went according to plan. American carriers were designed for chaos. On the flight deck of the Essex, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch Voris gripped the canopy rail of his F-6F Hellcat and felt the deck drop away beneath him. For a moment, less than a second, but long enough to register, he was airborne simply because the ship had fallen faster than gravity could pull him down. Then the deck rose again, slamming the landing gear struts with a force that shook his teeth. Green-shirted catapult crews crouched beside the bridle, waiting for the ship to stabilize. There was no stabilization. The deck pitched, rolled, heaved like a living thing. But the launch officer watched, timed the swells, and when the bow began to rise, when the deck angled upward toward the sky, his flag snapped down. The catapult fired. 27,000 pounds of aircraft and pilot accelerated from 0 to 90 miles per hour in less than 2 seconds. The force crushed Voris back into his seat. The Hellcat shot off the bow, and for one heart-stopping instant, the fighter dropped toward the water as the carrier's bow rose behind it. Voris shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared. The Hellcat clawed for altitude. Spray soaked the windscreen. He pulled back on the stick, not too hard, not too gentle, and the fighter began to climb. Behind him, another Hellcat launched, then another, then a Helldiver dive bomber, heavier, slower, wallowing through the turbulence like a truck on a dirt road, then an Avenger torpedo bomber. One after another, 36 aircraft flung themselves off the heaving deck into a sky the color of lead. The Japanese observers watching from their reconnaissance aircraft could not believe it. They radioed descriptions back to headquarters, but words felt inadequate. How do you explain that the Americans were not merely launching aircraft, but doing so in coordinated strikes? That the planes were forming up through the clouds, assembling into combat formations despite zero visibility? That they were navigating by instruments and radio beacons, flying through weather that should have scattered them across 100 miles of ocean? One Japanese pilot, a veteran of 2 years of combat, later wrote in his diary, "I watched them launch, and I knew we had already lost the war. Not because they had more ships or more planes. We knew that. But because they could do this thing that we could not do. And they did it as if it were routine. As if the ocean itself had bent to their will." The storm that Task Force 38 flew through on January 17, 1945, was not officially a typhoon. It was merely a winter storm system, typical for the Western Pacific in January. Winds 45 knots, seas 20 to 30 feet, visibility under 1 mile, cloud ceilings at 500 feet, conditions that the Japanese Navy classified as non-operational, conditions that, by American standards, were marginal but acceptable. This gap between Japanese and American definitions of operational weather represented something deeper than mere differences in doctrine. It represented differences in margin. The Americans had margin in fuel, in aircraft, in pilots, in equipment, in logistics. They could afford to lose aircraft to weather accidents because 3 more would arrive tomorrow. They could afford to push the operational envelope because failure would not mean the end of the campaign. Japan had no margin. Every aircraft lost to an operational accident was 1 less aircraft available for combat. Every pilot killed in a weather-related crash was a pilot who could not be replaced. Their training pipeline had collapsed. Their industrial base was being bombed daily. Their merchant fleet, which carried the oil and raw materials to keep their military functioning, was being sunk faster than ships could be built. They were fighting a war of scarcity against an enemy of abundance. And that abundance manifested not just in numbers, but in confidence. The Americans flew in storms because they knew that if they crashed, rescue submarines were stationed along the route. If they ditched, radar-equipped aircraft would search for them. If they were shot down, the fleet would return to recover them. This was not recklessness. It was calculated risk backed by overwhelming capability. The Japanese flew in storms only when there was no alternative. And when they did, they knew that if something went wrong, they were alone. No submarines waited to rescue them. No aircraft searched for downed pilots. The ocean claimed them, and the war moved on without pause. The strike group from Task Force 38 reached Takao Harbor 3 hours after launch. The weather had not improved. If anything, it had worsened. Rain fell in sheets so thick that pilots could barely see the aircraft flying 50 feet beside them. They descended through the clouds, relying entirely on instruments, trusting that the altitude readings were accurate, that the formation was where it was supposed to be, that the navigation calculations had been correct. At 800 feet, they broke through the cloud base and saw the harbor stretched out below. Gray water, darker gray ships, the smudge of the shore barely visible through the rain. Flak began immediately. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire dotted the sky. Tracers arced up through the gloom. The Japanese had been expecting them. Of course they had. The reconnaissance aircraft had reported American carriers in the area. But what the Japanese defenders had not expected was that the attack would come now, in this weather, when visibility was so poor that a pilot could barely see his target until he was in his dive. The American aircraft split into attack groups. The Hellcats went low, strafing anti-aircraft positions. The Helldivers rolled into their dives, 60-degree angles, pulling 4 Gs as they plummeted toward merchant ships and oilers. The Avengers came in at wave-top height, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies, skimming across water so rough that spray obscured their windscreens. The Japanese defenders fired everything they had. But their radar was primitive, their fire control systems designed for clear weather engagements. In the rain and chaos, they were shooting at sound, at glimpses, at ghosts. The American aircraft attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the defenses. Bombs fell, torpedoes ran, ships exploded, oil tanks ignited, sending pillars of black smoke into the storm. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the American aircraft were gone. Climbing back into the clouds, reforming, navigating back to their carriers through the same storm they had penetrated hours before. Recovering aircraft in a storm was, if anything, more dangerous than launching them. Pilots returning from a strike were exhausted, low on fuel, often damaged. The carrier deck was still pitching and rolling. But now there was no choice. The aircraft could not wait for better weather. They had minutes of fuel remaining. They would land, or they would ditch. The landing signal officers stood on their platforms at the stern of the carriers, fully exposed to wind and spray, waving their paddles in exaggerated motions to guide pilots in. The carriers turned into the wind to provide relative calm. But calm was relative. The deck still rose and fell. The LSO timed his cut signal, the command for the pilot to cut throttle and land, to coincide with the deck's position. Too early, and the aircraft would slam down as the deck rose. Too late, and it would float over the arresting wires and crash into the barrier. One after another, the aircraft came in. Hellcats caught the wire and jerked to a halt, their tailhooks grabbing the cable with a screech of metal on metal. Deck crews rushed forward to unhook them, pushing them forward to clear the landing area for the next aircraft. Helldivers came in heavier, sloppier, their dive brakes still deployed, bouncing once before catching the wire. Avengers wallowed in like cargo planes, their heavy engines laboring. Not all made it. One helldiver came in too high, missed all the wires, crashed into the barrier. The barrier cables caught it, but the impact shattered the propeller and caved in the engine cowling. Deck crews swarmed over it, pushing it aside while the next aircraft circled. One Avenger, its hydraulics shot out from flak damage, landed with its landing gear retracted. A controlled belly landing that sent sparks shooting across the deck but left the pilot uninjured. By nightfall, every aircraft had been recovered. Not one had been lost to weather. Several were damaged, several pilots were shaken. But the strike had been executed, the targets had been hit, and the fleet remained operational. In Japan, in the headquarters where intelligence reports accumulated like snow, the analysts tried to make sense of what had happened. The numbers were clear. The Americans had launched a full strike in conditions that Japan considered prohibitive. They had navigated to the target, executed a coordinated attack, and returned safely. This was not luck. This was not a one-time aberration. This was capability. And if the Americans could do this, if they could operate carriers in weather that grounded Japanese aircraft, then what else could they do that Japanese doctrine said was impossible? The mythology of samurai spirit had sustained Japanese forces through 4 years of war. The belief that superior willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The conviction that sacrifice and determination would triumph over decadence and comfort. Japanese training emphasized endurance, hardship, acceptance of death. American training, by comparison, seemed soft. Focused on safety, on bringing pilots home, on minimizing casualties. But now that mythology confronted a paradox, the Americans, with their supposed softness, were doing things that the Japanese, with their vaunted spirit, could not. They were flying in storms. They were sustaining operations without respite. They were attacking constantly, relentlessly, with a tempo that never slowed. The Japanese strategy had been to inflict enough casualties that America's will would break. But America's will showed no sign of breaking. If anything, it seemed to harden with each setback, to multiply with each loss. A Japanese naval officer, interviewed after the war, tried to explain the psychological impact. We had been told that Americans were weak, that they loved comfort, that they would quit when the fighting became hard. But then we saw them fly in weather that would kill our pilots. We saw them operate machines more complex than ours with crews who seemed almost casual about it. We saw them treat impossible things as merely difficult. And we realized that the story we had been told was wrong. They were not weak. They were terrifyingly strong. And the comfort, the abundance, the safety measures, these were not weaknesses. These were the products of a nation so powerful it could afford to care whether its soldiers lived or died. Throughout the winter of 1945, as American forces closed in on Japan itself, the pattern repeated. Task Force 38 operated continuously off the coast of the home islands. They struck airfields, they hit factories, they destroyed shipping, and they did it in weather that should have grounded them. February typhoons, March storms, rain, fog, wind that howled across the flight decks with force enough to knock a man down. The Japanese response grew increasingly desperate. Unable to match American operational capability, they turned to tactics that required no sophisticated training, no weather forecasting, no complex coordination. They created the kamikaze, the divine wind, suicide attacks that traded pilot and aircraft for the chance of damaging a single ship. It was a tactic born of desperation, but also of recognition. If you cannot fly in formation, fly alone. If you cannot execute complex attacks, reduce the attack to its simplest form. If you cannot bring your pilots home, make their deaths count for something. But even kamikaze attacks foundered against American operational capability. The radar picket ships detected incoming aircraft miles away. The combat air patrols intercepted them before they reached the carriers. The anti-aircraft fire, proximity-fused shells that didn't need a direct hit to destroy an aircraft, created a defensive barrier that few kamikazes penetrated. And those that did hit often struck ships that had been designed to absorb damage. Armored flight decks, watertight compartments, damage control parties trained to fight fires and contain flooding. The Americans learned to operate even with damaged carriers. The Franklin was hit by 2 bombs in March 1945. Bombs that penetrated to the hangar deck and detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft. The explosions and subsequent fires killed over 800 men. The ship should have sunk. Instead, the damage control parties contained the flooding, fought the fires, and brought the carrier back to port under its own power. It was repaired and returned to service. To Japanese observers, this was incomprehensible. An entire carrier air group destroyed, a third of the crew killed, the flight deck torn open, and the ship survived. They had seen Japanese carriers lost to single torpedo hits. They had watched carriers explode from gasoline fires that could not be contained. The Americans built ships that could absorb catastrophic damage and continue fighting. They built systems with redundancy upon redundancy. They built doctrine that assumed things would go wrong and planned accordingly. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese naval officers throughout those final months was not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was a photograph, a single image captured by a reconnaissance aircraft that circulated through combined fleet headquarters and was studied until the paper wore thin from handling. The photograph showed an American carrier conducting flight operations in heavy seas. In the foreground, a Hellcat was frozen at the moment of catapult launch, its nose angled upward, its propeller a blur, spray from the bow wave creating a halo around the aircraft. Behind it, more aircraft were spotted on the deck, ready for launch. In the background, other carriers were visible through the spray and rain, also conducting operations. But what drew the eye, what made officers stare at the image, was a small detail in the lower right corner. On the catwalk beside the flight deck, exposed to the wind and spray, a group of deck crew members stood watching the launch. And one of them, clearly visible through the telephoto lens, was eating something. Not hurriedly, not furtively, just eating. Standing on a heaving carrier deck in the middle of a storm, watching aircraft launch on a combat mission and casually eating what looked like a sandwich. The photograph became a symbol of everything Japanese officers both hated and feared about their enemy. The abundance that allowed a nation to feed its sailors so well they could eat between aircraft launches. The confidence that allowed men to treat combat operations as routine. The casual competence that made impossibly dangerous work look ordinary. Some officers refused to believe the photograph was real. It must be staged, they insisted. Propaganda. But others recognized the truth in it. They had seen American prisoners of war, fed better as captives than Japanese soldiers were fed in active service. They had captured American supply ships and found ice cream machines, laundry facilities, fresh fruit. They had recovered American life rafts equipped with fishing gear, water purification tablets, emergency rations that included chocolate. The Japanese military had been built on principles of austerity. Soldiers accepted hunger as normal. Rice and pickled vegetables were standard rations. Comfort was weakness. Hardship built character. But the Americans brought abundance to war. And that abundance was not weakness. It was power. It meant that American soldiers were healthier, stronger, better fed. It meant they could fight longer without exhaustion. It meant their morale remained high because they knew their nation cared enough to provide for them. The very comfort that Japanese propaganda mocked was the foundation of American operational capability. By April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The super battleship Yamato, sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, was sunk by American carrier aircraft before it could reach the island. The attack was conducted in clear weather, and the Yamato's anti-aircraft fire, while intense, was overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking aircraft. Wave after wave of Helldivers and Avengers struck the battleship with bombs and torpedoes until it rolled over and exploded. The Japanese carriers, once the pride of the fleet, were either sunk or immobilized in port without fuel or aircraft. Japan's last operational carrier, the Katsuragi, was hidden in a camouflaged anchorage, its flight deck empty, its hangars bare. It survived the war not through any combat effectiveness, but through being so irrelevant that American forces didn't bother to target it. The contrast could not have been starker. American carriers operated continuously, launching thousands of sorties, projecting power hundreds of miles inland. Japanese carriers sat silent, monuments to a capability that had been bled away through attrition and resource exhaustion. And yet, even in defeat, some Japanese officers clung to the belief that spirit had not failed, only resources. If Japan had possessed America's oil, America's steel, America's industrial capacity, surely the outcome would have been different. Surely Japanese courage combined with American abundance would have been unstoppable. But this belief missed the fundamental point. American operational capability was not merely the product of resources. It was the product of a system, political, social, economic, educational, that valued individual life enough to invest in saving it. The rescue submarines, the radar, the weather forecasting, the damage control, the redundant systems, these were not inevitable products of abundance. They were choices that reflected a society that believed its citizens were valuable, that their lives mattered, that bringing them home was worth the expense. Japan had made different choices. The kamikaze, the banzai charges, the refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. These were the products of a system that valued the collective over the individual, that saw soldiers as expendable, that treated death as preferable to dishonor. And in the end, the system that valued life proved more effective at war than the system that glorified death. The final carrier operations of World War II were conducted against the Japanese home islands in August 1945, even as atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American carriers continued launching strikes, hitting airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, maintaining pressure. The weather that week was mixed. Some days clear, some days overcast. On August 13th, Task Force 38 launched strikes through scattered thunderstorms. On August 15th, they launched strikes in the morning before the announcement of Japanese surrender reached the fleet. Several American aircraft were shot down by Japanese fighters who had not yet received the surrender order. These were the last American casualties of the war. When the surrender was finally confirmed, the carrier operations ceased. The aircraft were grounded. The catapults fell silent. The deck crews stood on the flight decks and watched the sky, and for the first time in months, there were no launches, no recoveries, no strikes to plan. In Japan, in the silent headquarters, in the burned-out cities, Japanese officers tried to understand what had happened. How had the nation of the samurai been defeated so completely? The answers were complex. Industrial capacity, strategic errors, resource limitations. But underlying all of it was a simpler truth that many found difficult to accept. They had believed that spirit could overcome material, that will could triumph over abundance, that sacrifice was its own form of power. But the Americans had demonstrated a different principle, that abundance enabled capability, that caring for your soldiers made them more effective, not less, that the most sophisticated weapon system in the world, the aircraft carrier, required not just courage, but resources, training, logistics, redundancy, and a society wealthy enough and committed enough to provide all of it. In the years after the war, as historians analyzed the campaigns, the Battle of Midway received attention as the turning point. The fall of Saipan was marked as the moment Japan's defeat became inevitable. The atomic bombs were debated as necessary evil or war crime. But among naval aviators, both American and Japanese, there was a different moment that embodied the war's essential nature. It was not a great battle. It was not a dramatic turning point. It was a winter day in January 1945, when American carriers launched aircraft in a storm that should have grounded them, and Japanese observers watched and understood that they were witnessing something more profound than tactical superiority. They were witnessing a different philosophy of war made manifest. A philosophy that said impossible conditions simply meant more difficult. That weather was an obstacle to manage, not an excuse to wait. That the mission would be accomplished because failure was unacceptable, and the systems, mechanical, logistical, human, were in place to ensure success. The Japanese naval officer who had watched the launches from his reconnaissance aircraft wrote in his diary that night, "Today, I saw the future of naval warfare, and we are not part of it. The Americans have created something we cannot match, not because we lack courage or skill, but because we lack the society that produces such capability. They fly in storms because they can afford to. They risk their pilots because they know they can save them. They operate with a confidence born of knowing that behind every carrier are 10 more. Behind every pilot are 100 more in training. Behind every aircraft are factories producing thousands more. We fought with the forces we had, knowing there would be no replacements. They fight with the forces they need, knowing there will always be more. This is not a war we can win. This is a war that was lost before it began, lost in the factories and schools and farms of America, lost in a system that produces not just steel and oil, but the confidence to use them without hesitation." Years later, in 1952, a Japanese naval officer visited the United States as part of a military exchange program. He toured American carriers, now hunting Soviet submarines in the Cold War. He watched launches and recoveries. He spoke with pilots and deck crews. And one day, standing on the flight deck of the Essex, the same ship that had launched strikes in the January 1945 storm, he asked an American officer how they had learned to operate in such conditions. The American seemed puzzled by the question. "We just trained for it," he said. "Weather happens. You can wait for perfect conditions, or you can learn to operate in what you've got. We figured it was better to learn." The Japanese officer nodded. It was such a simple answer. So American. Pragmatic, confident, stripped of philosophy or spirituality. Weather happens. You deal with it. But behind that simplicity was everything. An economy that could afford the fuel to train in bad weather. A military that valued bringing pilots home enough to invest in rescue systems. A society that asked, "How do we do this?" rather than, "Should we do this?" a people who treated impossibility not as a wall, but as a problem awaiting solution. The storm off Luzon in January 1945 had not been the deadliest battle of the Pacific War. It had not determined the outcome of any campaign, but it had been a revelation. A moment when the gap between Japanese and American capability became undeniable, when all the rationalizations and excuses fell away, leaving only the stark truth. One nation had built a military that operated despite obstacles. The other had built a military that used obstacles as excuses. One had treated war as a problem requiring solutions. The other had treated war as a test of spirit. And in the cold mathematics of industrial warfare, spirit without capability was just another form of denial. The carriers of Task Force 38 continued their operations through the spring and summer of 1945, through storms and clear weather, through heavy opposition and none at all. They flew because they could. They attacked because they were there. And they brought their pilots home because a nation wealthy enough and committed enough had built systems to make it possible. And somewhere in the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy, in the silent carriers and empty hangars, was the lesson that would take a generation to fully absorb. That modernity had changed the nature of warfare, that industrial capacity was now the ultimate weapon, and that abundance, properly organized and intelligently applied, was not decadence, but devastating power. The Americans had launched aircraft in a typhoon, and in doing so, they had announced to the world that the age of romantic warfare, of samurai spirit and glorious death, had ended. The new age belonged to radar and radios, to logistics and redundancy, to nations that could afford to care whether their soldiers survived. It belonged to the engineers and the factory workers, to the supply officers and the meteorologists, to everyone who made it possible for a pilot to fly through a storm and come home to a carrier that would still be there, still operating, still fighting. The storm itself passed within 12 hours. The sea calmed. The clouds lifted. The sun emerged. But the revelation remained. And every Japanese officer who understood what had happened that day knew that the war was over, even if the fighting continued for 8 more months. They had seen the future, and they were not part of it.